Okay, moving along with our trig, we're going to graph sine and cosine. These are the only two graphs we're going to worry about, but we do have graphs for all of them. But sine and cosine are kind of the most common ones, the more important ones in terms of our standards. All right, so sine and cosine actually look the same. So for a sine equation, when we go to graph it, we can actually come up with a cosine equation that has that same graph. All right, now we'll talk about how they look different, even though they have the same shape in a second. But there's a couple of things you're going to have to be able to find when you are graphing or when you're given an equation or given a graph. Right? The first thing is going to be our midline. So the midline is the line in the middle, right? So if you notice, you go up to a certain point, that's the high point, and then you come down to a point. Then you go back up to that same point, then back down. Right in the middle where I have these dots, that's our midline. It's always a horizontal line. So if you are trying to find the midline in terms of given a graph, then you take the mountaintops and the valleys and you find right in the middle. When you write the equation of a midline, it's always y equals a number because it's horizontal. Okay, another thing that we've got to find, let's switch to green, is what we call the amplitude. Now amplitude sounds like altitude, and altitude means height, and amplitude is similar to height, but it's not the height of the whole thing. It's not from the very top to the bottom. It's actually from the top to the midline, or from the midline to the bottom. That's going to be the same value, and that is our amplitude. So if you have to find the amplitude when you're given a graph, you start from the top and count down to the midline, or the bottom to the midline, either way. Okay, then we've also got a period, which is, switch colors. If I'm talking about the period of a graph, that's talking about how long it takes to get through one cycle. If you know or notice, if I start here on the far left, I'm going to go up, come all the way down, come around, stop. Go again, up, come down, come around, stop. And then I just keep doing that same pattern. So every part of my sine and cosine graph is the repetition of this one shape. All right, so from the beginning of that shape to the end of that shape, that distance is the period. Okay, now that distance is going to be the same no matter where you start. Like I could have started that cycle on the bottom here. From the time I go all the way up and back to the bottom, and then I start repeating, that distance is going to be the same. So it doesn't matter where you choose your starting point to be, you're just looking for one full cycle, and that's going to be the length of your period. Okay, and then the last thing you got to be able to get from the graph is going to be our maximum and minimum values. So the maximum values, we're talking about y values, right? The max value is going to be wherever the top is. Okay, so it's always going to be the same top every time you get to a mountain. So that y value there is the max, and then the min is the bottom. So those are pretty easy to get. All right, then we have equations that we're going to use to get some of this information as well. So let's see, we'll switch to, we'll go with dark blue. Okay, so my equations, oh, no y, I already got a y. My equation all look the same, but the only difference is one of them is going to be my sine, and then we got, well, I guess I could have used that, but we'll go back. X minus h plus k. That was gross. Sorry. Okay, then I have the other equation. Oh my goodness. And you get the whiteout out. This is a mess. But I'm going to use cosine, so it's the same thing. Slightly prettier, not much. I don't know what was going on in my head then. Okay, but we have this equation with a, b, h, and k. Now, we've seen this, right? Not, during this last couple weeks or during these weeks, but we have seen a, b, h, and k. It's in all of our equations, and these a, b, h, and k are going to end up doing the same thing. But we might call them something different or think about it differently when it comes to sine and cosine. All right, so to start with, you can get your midline directly from this equation, and that's going to be whatever k is. Okay, now K is also my vertical shift, so that tells me how far up and down I'm going, but in terms of what we're trying to cover in our quick version. I'm just going to worry about that being the midline. Okay, now K makes it go up and down. This H value is what we call phase shift. That moves it left and right. But again, we're not stressing over that right now. We're getting a very condensed version. Okay, we also need to be able to find the amplitude. And so conveniently, it's going to come from our A value. Okay, now A is going to give us the amplitude, but you can't have a negative height, right? So we don't consider a height or a distance to be negative. If A is negative, ignore the negative when you're finding your amplitude, but that negative A just reflects it. So if this one was reflected, instead of starting here and going up and going around, it would start here and go down and go around. So it's still the same shape, it would just start off differently. All right, and then the other thing we need to find that comes directly from our equation is our period. Now the period doesn't come directly from the equation, but we're going to use B to figure out the period. So the period is going to be 2 pi, period equals 2 pi divided by B. All right, and the reason being is because 2 pi is our normal period of the parent function for just sine of x. And then now this B is going to stretch or compress it horizontally, so it's going to make it fatter and skinnier. So the B tells us how many times we're going to have our normal cycle in our typical period of 2 pi. So you just got to memorize that little formula there. Okay, so K is our midline, A is the amplitude, B gives us the period. To figure out the max and min, we just add our amplitude to the midline, and that's going to give you the max, and we subtract it from the midline to get the min. All right, so now we got a couple of examples. All right, so for these 4 examples, we're not actually graphing. Side note, the difference between sine and cosine when it actually comes to the graph. Let me switch. We'll do orange. Okay, the difference here is that when you graph sine, like my parent function for sine, it's going to be that same curve, but it starts at 0, 0, and then it goes up, middle, down, middle. So there's my sine graph. Okay, cosine is the same wave, but instead of starting in the middle, it starts at the top, and it comes down, down, middle, top. So it just starts at a different place. And remember, it keeps going. So if you look at 2 graphs, like one sine and one cosine, they look the same. You're not going to know which one it is, right? Because you can write an equation and make it sine and cosine, but have the same graph. Okay, but that's the difference. Again, we're not focusing on that part as much as the shape in general. Okay, so we want to determine the midline, amplitude, period, and the max and min value. So the first 2 are equations. The second 2 will get everything from the graph. So to begin with, I'm going to start with the midline. Right off the bat, I know that my midline, okay, is at y equals 1. It's always at y equals. Okay, and then over here, y equals midline, a -3. Okay, so your midline's always that K value, right? Amplitude is always the first number, so my amplitude is 4. Okay, and again, this one, ignore that negative. That negative just means it's reflected. So my amplitude here is a 2. All right, and then the period, it's going to be 2 pi divided by B. My B here is 3. So we have 2 pi divided by 3. I can't simplify that, so I'm done. That's the period. All right, over here, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 4 pi. Okay, remember pi is a number, right? So even though it looks like you have 2 variables here, 4 pi is a number. They stay together. So it's whatever's in front of the x. So 2 pi over 4 pi, my pi's cancel, and then 2 over 4 simplifies to a half. So in this case, the period is 1/2. Okay, to find the max and the min values, right? So my midline's at 1. Okay, so you can imagine you're at 1. Oh, sorry. And then my amplitude is 4. So that means I'm going to go up 4 at some point, and then I'm also going to go down 4 at some point. So to find your max and min, you're going to add and subtract the amplitude from the midline. So my max is going to be 1 plus 4, which is 5. And the min is going to be 1 minus 4, which is negative 3. All right, over here, my max is going to be my midline plus the amplitude, which is negative 1. And then the minimum is going to be the midline minus the amplitude, which is 2, not 1. And that's going to be negative 5. So my max is negative 1, my min is negative 5. Okay, and from the graphs, we're going to do kind of like what I did in the beginning where I labeled everything. So if I want to find my midline, I'm going to find the middle, right? So here's my high, right? Well, let's start with the max and min since that's a little easier to see. There's my high. Okay, here's my low. So my max is at 3, and my min is at negative 2. Okay, and then the midline is going to go right in the middle of that. So halfway between positive 3 and negative 2 is going to be a 1. No, it's not. This is a terrible. I did not do a very good graph. Halfway between is going to be a 0.5, and that was my fault. Did not graph that very pretty. Can't count, apparently. Okay, but so ignoring those points right there, those aren't my pretty points, it's going to be halfway in the middle. All right, and again, because I didn't graph this one very well, my amplitude and period are going to look a little weird. All right, so I'm going to go from the middle up. So that's going to be 1, 2 1/2. So my amplitude is 2 1/2, right? Or 5/2, whichever one you want to use. And then the period, we're going to pretend that it's going to be these pretty points just because it was my fault. So this is one full cycle. So from negative pi to 3 pi is how long it takes to go one full cycle. So from negative pi to 3 pi, that actually covers 4 tick marks, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, and each tick mark is worth pi. So then that means the period is going to be 4 pi. Okay, or if you wanted to, you could start here. Start at 0. That's not a bad place to start. Go all the way down and back up, and then that takes you from 0 to 4 pi. Same thing. It doesn't matter where you start as long as you get back to where you started before you start a new cycle. Okay, and again, that graph's a little off. My apologies. All right, hopefully this one's better if I can count better. So let's start with our max and our min. So my max is going to be up here, and that's at 2. And then my min's going to be down here, and that's at 2, 4, 6. So my min is at negative 6. Halfway between 2 and negative 6 is negative 2. So I did this one right, it looks like. So then my midline is at y equals negative 2. Okay, my amplitude, for this one I'm just going to choose this chunk right here. So to go from my midline down to the bottom, that's 4 tick marks. So then my amplitude is 4. Okay, and then the period, I'm going to choose 0 this time, just so I can count a little easier. So I go up and all the way down and back. So this distance right here is what looks to be 4 tick marks. So now for this one, I have to figure out what each tick mark is worth. So over here, I told you that first tick mark was pi, then we went 2 pi, then 3 pi. Here, I only gave you that third tick mark. So to figure out what this tick mark means, this is my third one. I want one of those thirds. So I'm going to take pi and divide it by 3. So that's pi over 3, or 1/3 pi. Okay, so now I need to go 1 tick mark past pi. So that means I need to do pi plus pi over 3. All right, so that's crazy looking, but pi plus pi over 3. This is like 1 plus a third. Okay, so 1 plus a third is 1 1/3, or 4 thirds. So that means that my period is 4 pi over 3. Okay, another way of looking at it, once you find 1 tick mark, right, once I took pi and divided it by 3 to get down to what that first tick mark was, then I can count up. So this is 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3. Okay, so you got to find the highest point and the lowest point, your middle, okay, your amplitude, and your period.